The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chaya Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello, you lovely lot. Thanks so much for joining me for this week's episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. Now, something I think we would all agree on is that there is nothing better than a survival story, a tale of a person defying all odds to make it through a situation which seemed hopeless or doomed to end in tragedy. So today, I wanted to share the unbelievable story of a man named Harrison Okene, who made headlines back in 2013 when he survived a truly harrowing ordeal. This guy is nothing short of incredible. So let's get started. Harrison Okene had always loved the ocean. As a child, he dreamed of one day owning his own house by the sea in his home country of Nigeria. And when it came to choosing his career path, he knew that some element of being out on the water would be a real plus point for him. In 2010, Harrison had been working as a chef with companies who were doing large-scale catering jobs, which he has spoken about finding quite stressful, especially for the low rate of pay he would receive. When the opportunity arose to work as a chef on a tugboat, Harrison, who was in his mid-20s at the time, completed the necessary certification and took the job, becoming part of a 12-person crew working aboard the vessel known as Jaskin 4. If you don't know, and don't worry, I didn't know this either before researching this story, a tugboat is a small but powerful boat which has the task of pushing or towing other vessels, and in this case the Jaskin 4 had been deployed to help out an oil tanker located around 20 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria. The tugboat would be out at sea for days at a time, and Harrison had a particular routine that he would follow each day in order to efficiently prepare meals for himself and his 11 crewmates. On the morning of the 26th of May 2013, his day began like any other. By this point, Harrison was 29 years old and had a few years of experience working on the boat, so he was settled into a proper routine. He woke up, prayed, and went out to the galley area to start getting things ready for breakfast. After turning on the hot plates, he quickly popped into the bathroom to get himself ready whilst they heated up, having no idea whatsoever that this small, seemingly insignificant decision would actually end up saving his life. By this time, it was around 5 a.m. and Harrison was in the bathroom, by his own admission, sitting on the toilet, when disaster struck. From the cubicle he was in, he heard one of his colleagues shout the most chilling words you could imagine in this scenario. The vessel is about to capsize. A huge, surging wave hit the tugboat so unexpectedly that it's often been described as a freak event, and everything was instantly thrown into chaos. The entire boat was flipped upside down, and remember, this was a 12-person watercraft. So you can imagine the force it took for this to happen. Harrison remembers that after the impact of the wave, he was thrown to what felt like the floor, but would have actually been the ceiling given that the boat had capsized, with the toilet now above him over his head. Instinctively, he tried to get to the door to free himself from the cubicle when the toilet unit became unstuck and fell onto him, hitting his head. Harrison recalls that he just about had time to see and feel the blood dripping down his face before the power in the vessel completely failed and he was plunged into darkness. Even just saying these words, I actually feel quite nauseous. I'm not sure that there is anything that is quite as scary as the feeling of being trapped in a small space in a boat that is upside down 20 kilometers out to sea. It's genuinely horrifying, and this was just the beginning of Harrison's ordeal. Despite not being able to see a thing, he knew that he had to get out of the bathroom, as the cubicle was slowly starting to fill up with water. He located the door handle and eventually managed to push it open and make his way out. But even when he did, it was almost impossible to see anything. Plus, remember that the boat was upside down, so everything was in the wrong place, and Harrison had no idea which way he was facing or exactly how to get to any particular part of the vessel. After moving around as best as he could, wading through the water that was continuing to rise in the corridors of the boat, he managed to locate the path which would lead to the vessel's watertight door, which would act as their exit hatch. And as he reached this area, he spotted 2, perhaps 3 of his crewmates. Together, they tried their very best to open up the door, but the water level was rising so quickly that the men were soon submerged. Harrison realized he had to make a choice. He could either stay in that exact same spot with his colleagues, underwater and rapidly running out of air, with no real hope of opening the hatch, or he could move back inside the boat and try to find an alternative way out of this situation. In a split-second decision, he decided on the latter, and he went back to try and find a part of the tugboat that was not yet completely filled with water, so he could at least catch his breath and try to work out his next move. But fate was set to decide this move for him. Harrison described how the force of the water ended up pushing him into another toilet cubicle. This time it was one attached to the second engineer's cabin, with the growing pressure forcing the door closed behind him. Now bear in mind that the whole time the vessel is filling up with water, it's also sinking. So as Harrison is forced into this cubicle by the water, the entire boat is plummeting down towards the seabed. And as it got closer, he explains that the boat's anchors started to drop, and recalls that all he could hear was shouting from his crewmates coming from all different directions. When I say this was pure chaos, it's no understatement. The level of pure panic and fear in that boat must have been overwhelming. Now, after the vessel reached the seabed, Harrison had come to the conclusion that the watertight door must be the key to the crew's survival. In an attempt to open the cubicle's door and make his way back there, he actually broke the handle. But rather than seeing this as yet another setback, Harrison was able to put himself into this state of intense focus and calm. And he got creative. He managed to break off a piece of metal from a vent cover and used this to prise the door open, meaning he could emerge into the second engineer's cabin. Fighting against the water pressure once more, he was eventually able to get this room's door open, and his sights were now set on the watertight door. Over the next few hours, he ended up making around 10 trips backwards and forwards from this spot, which wasn't entirely flooded, to the escape hatch, trying with all his strength to open it. Because it was so dark, although he had found a couple of small lights from a life jacket floating in the water, he actually fashioned a system made from an improvised rope, made of things like scraps of cloth tied together, which he then attached to a water dispenser, and this allowed him to guide himself between the cabin and the watertight door. The thing is, he had to be able to get back to the cabin very quickly, as he would run out of breath during his attempts to open the hatch, which was totally underwater. But after multiple trips, he was completely exhausted and freezing cold. Harrison was dressed only in his boxer shorts, and it was absolutely vital that he took some time to both rest and try to warm up. He had no energy left to give, but the idea of taking a moment to recuperate was easier said than done. Inside the cabin, he had no choice but to stand up, or else the water level would be over his head. When he was standing, it came up to his chest, and he only had a small bit of room above his head too, so he had to think fast if he was going to somehow get himself out of the incredibly cold water. What he was able to do was pull some wooden panels from the inside body of the vessel, and he actually made a raft out of these and some other debris, meaning that his legs were still submerged, but at least the rest of his body wasn't, and he could finally take a moment to breathe and think and try to get his head around the unbelievable situation he was in. In a filmed interview he did, Harrison spoke about how the shouts of his crewmates started to fade away one by one. In the utter turmoil and, of course, the darkness, it was impossible to know where anyone else was, and I imagine they would have been working largely on sound, hearing each other's voices. When the vessel fell silent, it must have been the strangest and scariest feeling imaginable. As I mentioned, Harrison's legs were still in the water, and he described how crayfish soon found him and started to nibble away at his skin, but there was very little he could do about it. As a devoutly religious man, he says that at this time he thought back to the fact that he'd prayed to God for a job in the marine industry, and that this had come true. His thinking was that if this job had been granted to him by a higher power, then he could also be saved from this situation he'd encountered because of that job through further prayer, and that is what he did. Largely deprived of his sense of sight due to the darkness, with absolutely no idea of how much time had passed, hearing only the noises of the other vessels above him on the water's surface, he prayed and he waited. In the cabin, he had found a can of Coke and a tin of sardines, and that is all he had to sustain himself. Harrison remembers thinking of his family as he sat in the cabin, the water lapping around his legs, in particular worrying for the well-being of his wife should he not return home, and just knowing in his heart that he had to make it out alive to be there for her, and he remained this way for almost 60 hours, almost 3 days. And then a miracle happened. Harrison thought he heard the sound of someone jumping into the water, followed soon after by the flash of a torchlight. He had been holding out a true and sincere hope that a rescue party would be coming for the crew, although he knew that some of his colleagues had sadly perished in the corridors of the boat, as he had felt their bodies in the water during his trips from the cabin to the watertight door. He was clinging to the belief that at least some of them had somehow managed to escape and possibly have raised the alarm. He had previously suspected that someone was outside the vessel, and he had banged repeatedly on any surface he could to try and get their attention. But this time he was certain it was a person. Taking in a deep breath, Harrison managed to swim out towards the watertight door, holding his breath the entire time, when he saw the glistening helmet of a diver before him. He reached out his hand, waving to get the diver's attention, and this moment is actually captured on a camera attached to the rescue diver. At first, you can tell that the diver thinks he has located a body floating in the water, until Harrison grabs his hand. Now that the rescuers knew that he was there, he returned to the cabin to take a deep breath of air, I'm sure feeling a sense of relief that would be almost impossible for most of us to comprehend. Now, one of the most incredible parts about this tale is that, as I mentioned, the rescue team were wearing cameras. So there is footage of the moment the divers came face to face with Harrison in the cabin, and you can see him almost recoil in shock that he was found and was going to be saved. Now, I do keep saying the phrase rescue team, but the tragic fact is that they hadn't originally gone down there thinking that there was any hope of the crew still being alive. It was really a mission to retrieve the bodies of the poor souls who they were sure had now passed away. So when they saw Harrison, it must have been as much of a shock for them as it was for him. The divers, who were part of the DCN Global Diving Company, were able to give Harrison some breathing apparatus, but due to the amount of time he had been trapped, the team were incredibly concerned about his well-being, not just because of things like the pressure changes, but also because he had been in this one small air pocket. They were very worried that he may well have carbon dioxide poisoning, so they had to take some incredibly strict measures. If they had simply taken Harrison to the surface of the water immediately, he would not have survived. So he was first taken to a diver's bell, which is essentially an open-bottomed dome, which has its own air pocket inside, before he was transferred to a recompression chamber, where he remained for a further 3 days until it was safe for him to resurface. But another miracle was yet to occur. When Harrison's vital signs were checked, everything appeared normal. Things like his blood pressure and temperature were all okay, and although he couldn't believe his luck on this front, I'm sure that he was already in so much disbelief about the entire situation that he just went with it. All Harrison really wanted to do now was see his family. Now, whilst this story is absolutely incredible, there is a very somber side to it as well. I'm very sad to say that Harrison's crewmates weren't as lucky as he was. Tragically, all 11 of his colleagues did perish in the incident, which is unbelievably heartbreaking, and my heart really does go out to their loved ones. Many of the crew members were still asleep and actually locked in their cabins when the wave hit the vessel, which is a precaution they would take due to the threat of pirate activity, and it's thought that this is actually what prevented some of them escaping their rooms before they flooded. It's genuinely awful to think about. So, how on earth did Harrison manage to survive? What's the science behind it? I've mentioned this case to a few different people now, and all of them have had the same 2 questions. How is it possible that the cabin didn't totally flood? And how did Harrison survive breathing that same pocket of air for almost 3 days? Well, here's what I found out. In terms of how the air pocket formed, from what I understand, when something like a boat sinks, there's a chance that in an enclosed space, air can sometimes be pushed up to the surface due to the pressure of the water that's filling that area. The cabin that Harrison was positioned in looked to have been at the highest point in the vessel, as it landed at an angle. I'm not 100% sure about this one, so if any scientists are listening, please do let me know if this is correct or not. But I do wonder if this positioning meant that an air pocket was more likely to form from there. I don't know, perhaps it was a coincidence. But after seeing a diagram of the wreckage and where Harrison ended up, it did make me think. As for the second question, I learned a little bit more about this one, largely thanks to a brilliant article produced by National Geographic. According to Eric Hackstall, who's an expert in diving medicine at the Duke Center for Hyperbaric Medicine and Environmental Physiology, in an air bubble the size of the one Harrison was stuck in, around 13.5 cubic meters, the symptoms of carbon dioxide toxicity would start to set in after around 56 hours, obviously due to the person continually breathing out into a limited air supply. high. Hextall believes that in that size of an air pocket, it would take around 79 hours for a person to lose consciousness from the poisoning. So what this means is that Harrison was found just about within the window for survival. There were other risks too, of course, things like the possibility of nitrogen narcosis due to the high air pressure in the bubble, not to mention the very real threat of hypothermia too. All in all, Harrison was probably one of the luckiest men in the world to make it out of this incident alive and well. When I was learning about Harrison's story and I got to this point in the tale, I thought to myself, this is genuinely one of the most astonishing accounts I've ever heard. More than one person should ever go through in their life. And I assumed that his rescue would spell the end of the major events in Harrison's life. But I was very wrong indeed. You will not believe what took place just the very next year after the sinking of the Jaskin 4 vessel. It almost left me entirely lost for words. In 2014, Harrison was driving himself and a friend to work when he suddenly lost control of his vehicle. At that moment, they were traveling over a bridge in the Nigerian city of Port Harcourt, and the car veered off the road and over the side of the bridge into the water below. Harrison remembers opening his eyes and realizing that his 4 car tires were pointing upwards, and he managed to free himself and swim out of the car. Quickly though, he realized that his friend was still in the passenger seat, so he went back under the water to help his companion, and the pair were soon able to get back to the surface and out of the water. Astonishingly, they were both largely unharmed and uninjured, to the point that they were able to make their way to the local police station to report the accident, only to be told they'd have to find a way to remove the car from the water themselves. Harrison says that they took a rope and managed to drag the car out, presumably with a few additional pairs of hands to assist them, and it was at this moment that he had a huge realization. Understandably, after his first miraculous survival in the boat, he had struggled to come to terms with what had happened to him. He spoke about feeling lost and unsure of his purpose in the world, but this second incident proved to be something of a reawakening. In his own words, quote, "So I went down into the water again to put the rope around the car and bring the car out. After that, I told myself, what are you afraid of? How can you be scared? You have seen so much. If you have come through this, I think you should not be afraid of anything." The thing is, Harrison had survived much more than just these 2 major life-threatening situations. He's openly spoken about some of the difficulties he endured growing up in an area he describes as a rough zone, noting that tragically many of the friends he grew up with are no longer alive. In particular, he detailed one situation where he was caught in some crossfire between a group of burglars and a night guard near to where he lived. He was mistaken for one of the burglars by the security guard, and several shots were fired in his direction, despite the fact that he was just trying to walk home from the market. Harrison credits his survival as a young man with what he describes as choosing the right path, opting to stay as far away from situations that could turn into trouble as he could. But he also says that his faith and religious beliefs only strengthened as a result of these terrifying encounters. Now, I have mentioned before on the podcast that I'm not a religious person myself, but hearing Harrison talk about how his faith has helped him through the wild situations he's found himself himself in is genuinely heartwarming, and I'm so glad that it's been a source of comfort and stability for him. There was something else I wanted to mention which links back to this topic of spirituality too, and this is a bizarre footnote in this tale that I think is often overlooked, but as soon as I heard Harrison speak about it, I sat up straight and wanted to hear more immediately. He revealed that prior to the Jaskin 4 disaster, he had actually had a dream that he was on a vessel that capsized, and in this dream he envisioned himself stuck in a particular place in the boat, in an enclosed area. How weird is that? Harrison said that if he ever had a dream like this, which felt more like a premonition, as long as he prayed about it afterwards, he felt that it wouldn't end up coming true. That was his belief. I'm not totally clear on whether he had prayed after having this dream or not, but he said that he felt as though the dream was showing him how he was going to die. But as we know, he thankfully made it out alive. I just had to share that part with you. I'm absolutely fascinated by the concept of premonitions, and it was so interesting to hear Harrison speak about his. So, if you were Harrison and you had come out of the other side of these unthinkable incidents, what would you have done next? Perhaps had a change of career? Maybe moved inland away from the potential dangers of the open sea? Well, not Harrison. In fact, his life story following on from his rescue is utterly captivating to hear about. In 2015, he experienced some further life-changing events. Sadly, he and his wife separated, and he has been vocal about encountering feelings of depression and loneliness, which he kept mostly to himself. Harrison knew that something had to change, and after being advised against seeking a new career as a train driver by his brother due to safety concerns, he knew in his heart that there was only one thing for him to do. Speaking about this new turning point, he said, quote, "If I had sat down and said, I'm not going to the ocean again, I would not be here today. I have faced a lot of my fears in my life, and I decided to face this once and for all. I know it should be my fear, but I don't need to be scared of water, because I need to embrace my fear once and for all and be strong. Our happiness, our joy, our future, they are all in our hands. I had to reprogram my thinking. I balanced my mind." Harrison was referring to the fact that he had now picked a new path in life. He was going to become a diver. He booked himself onto a 3-month course and spent countless hours underwater learning a host of new skills, which built the foundation for the work that, as far as I know, he still does to this day. Harrison is now in his early 40s, and as of 2023, he was still working as a diver, with his duties involving constructing and repairing elements on oil and gas rigs, underwater of course. This work involves him once again being aboard a vessel with a crew, which I just think is one of the most amazing things I've ever heard. I told you in the introduction that Harrison was an incredible person, and hopefully you can understand why I think that. He now has a partner and 3 children and owns a house by a lake, though if money was no object, he still says he'd love to live by the ocean. In some ways, there were parts of Harrison's story that reminded me of the incredible survival of Mary Vincent, which I covered in episode 40 of the podcast. The circumstances were completely different. Mary's situation was the result of a vicious attack, whereas Harrison's was a disaster caused by nature. But the theme that runs so strongly through the heart of both tales is that neither ever gave up hope. Against all odds, odds that are hard to even fathom, both Mary and Harrison survived and went on to live amazing lives. In a world that can sometimes feel a bit hopeless, I often find myself thinking about Mary, and I know that Harrison will also come to mind for me during those moments now too. Harrison has spoken in interviews about the meaning he's found in life following his ordeals, about how being so close to death has made him realize that we are all one, and that the way that we touch other people's lives is what really matters. I also wanted to end by acknowledging the incredible bravery of the rescue divers too. For all they knew, when they were heading down to the wreckage, they were on a mission to retrieve the bodies of the crew to give their poor families the chance to say goodbye. Little did they know that they would end up saving a life that day. But even without that knowledge, they were still willing to do what they felt was right and head down to the seabed, risking their own safety in the process. It's just one more factor that makes this astonishing tale all the more extraordinary. Oh my goodness, what a story. I would absolutely encourage you to head on over to the YouTube links I'll be including in the show notes or description box and watch the interviews with Harrison for yourselves. Hearing him speak about what he endured is completely inspiring and really powerful. I think he is truly amazing. Had you heard about Harrison's story before? Do you remember it from the news at the time? It's another one of those tales that I can't believe isn't more widely referenced. I think it's one of the most incredible survival stories I've ever heard. I would love to hear your thoughts on this story, so please do pop me a comment wherever you're tuning in from today. But before I let you go, it's time for our outro feature. So join me as we head on over to Weird Media. I wanted to keep things lovely and light-hearted for Weird Media today, and the second I decided that, I just knew what I had to recommend today. Now, for many of you, this won't be anything new, but I wanted to talk about it on the off chance that at least a handful of you here today will finally be convinced to watch this particular series. And the show in question is Friday Night Dinner. Not to be that person, but it is true that I did watch Friday Night Dinner in real time as it came out on Channel 4. I've been a Tamsin Greig fan since she was in Black Books, and a massive Mark Heap fan since he was in Spaced. So as soon as I saw that they were going to be in a new sitcom together, I had to check it out. And ever since then, for the almost 10 years that it ran, Friday Night Dinner became a complete comfort show for me. And I've just finished doing probably my 100th rewatch of it, and it is magnificent. The basic premise is that every Friday night, the Goodman family, who are Jewish, have their traditional dinner together. This involves their two sons, Adam and Johnny, heading back to the family home, where they're greeted by their dad Martin and their mum Jackie, with their neighbour Jim making regular and often unwanted appearances, which usually lead to chaos. Chaos is a running theme in the show for sure. Every episode there is something that goes wrong, and the result is always absolutely hilarious. There's also a special that was produced once the show had been running for 10 years, where the cast talk about the making of Friday Night Dinner, and I actually couldn't bring myself to watch it for a long time because I was so sad about the death of Paul Ritter, who played the dad Martin. But I recently put it on and it was honestly an absolute joy to watch. Bittersweet for sure, but a great tribute to the show. If you've never seen Friday Night Dinner, take this as your sign to give it a go. It's just beyond brilliant. And if you have already fallen in love with it, I would say that there's never a bad time to give it a rewatch. A massive thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout outs and links to the sources I used during my research. And I'll also be listing all of our social media pages as well as our email address. Please do leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or TikTok and tell me what you made of today's story. If you've enjoyed this episode and have a spare moment or two, I'm always hugely appreciative of a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's a brilliant free way to support the show. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to give this video a thumbs up and click that subscribe button. Thank you once again for being here today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.